in Module 5, we're going to talk about how to secure your letters of recommendation. Now, I very deliberately titled this module Cultivate Your Advocates rather than Find Letters of Recommendation because I think probably the most common thing or the most important thing I've seen that differentiates people who really do a good job of lining up letters of recommendation versus those who don't is the mentality and the mindset they bring to the table. I see far too many people view the letters of recommendation as sort of a last-minute chore that you pull together, when in reality, the quality of the letters of recommendation that you have really is going to reflect the amount of strategy, the amount of work, and the amount of deliberate, proactive attention and diligence that you've paid to this process. And that's why I use the word cultivate, because it's really a proactive effort at relationship building that is going to lead to having good letters of recommendation, which are ultimately people who are advocating for you, making the case for you of why you should get into the schools that you're applying to. Now, to give you an idea of what I mean by cultivate, I'll walk you through how I navigated this process to a large extent over the course of this module. But in many ways, with at least one of my letters of recommendation, the process actually began during my freshman year of high school. What ended up happening was I had played tennis tournaments throughout my beginning at a very young age. So by the time I got to my freshman year of high school, I was pretty good compared to the people who were on the team. And so I played #1 singles in high school, and I was also elected to be the captain of the team my freshman year. And it so happened that one of the seniors who was on the team that year, his father was a prominent judge in Rhode Island. So I got to know him at that time and just became friends with him and told him about my interest in the law and so forth. Now, why this ended up mattering is that a couple of years, so first of all, I mean, the father himself was this judge was a tennis player. He played in the men's leagues in Rhode Island, and so he and my father got to know each other, and whenever I was around, I made it a point to keep in touch with him. And then I remember my freshman year at Brown, this judge, he had been he had basically been a Supreme Court justice in Rhode Island, and then he retired, and Brown invited him to give a talk at Brown, and I cleared out my schedule, and I showed up to the talk, and it was held in a small room. There were only, I think, like 5 or 6 people. I mean, not too many people showed up, and so that made an impression on him. And then a couple years later, when he taught a course at Brown, as an adjunct, I signed up for it, and in addition to doing well in the course, I also sort of really made it a point to write a good final paper that was memorable. And so obviously, by the time that I was thinking seriously about what my letters of recommendation would be, I was able to go to him, and his letter reflected a lot of different dimensions about me, not only how I did in the course and my academic record, but he was also in a position to talk about me in a more personal light, with the benefit of a lot of years that I think is relatively unusual for a letter of recommendation. So, that's only an example, but I'm going to walk you through here what I recommend for how you can line up good letters of recommendation. So, as I mentioned, the #1 thing that I would recommend is really sort of thinking about this with a new mentality, a new mindset, where you're really dealing with a proactive effort, and one where you're driving, you're spearheading the process, and really your skills at cultivating relationships is being tested. Now, it obviously varies a little bit by law school, but I think generally the idea here is that you need a minimum of 2 letters of recommendation, and you're allowed to send in up to 4. Now, but a lot of the advice that I've seen in terms of letters of recommendation, people say, well, don't overdo it. You don't need to send 4 or whatever. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I have a little bit of a different view on the matter. But I think what the advice from the admissions officers pretty clearly says, and what I agree with wholeheartedly, is that 2 of your letters of recommendation need to be from professors who taught you at the undergraduate level. It doesn't matter if you already have a PhD. It doesn't matter if you've been out working or doing other things. These letters of recommendation, at a minimum of 2 of them, really need to come from professors who taught you as an undergrad, who can comment on your academic ability. And this is obviously undergraduate performance, along with the LSAT, are a common factor here where you're being judged compared to other applicants. So knowing that you need a minimum of 2 academic letters of reference, this really ought to be informing and shaping your strategy right from the beginning of college, and really thinking about, as you do your course selection, obviously you need to be thinking about where you can get A's and what you can do for your GPA. But I would say that another critical factor here would be to try to take academic courses, take a course, select classes, schedule your sort of academic workload and so forth, with the idea that you want to have 2 letters of recommendation from professors. Now, if you've been following my work, you know that I advocate thinking about the law school admissions process with the frame of trying to be the best applicant you possibly can. And I think it's worth asking the question here: what would be, what do the best applicants to law school, what kinds of letters of recommendation are they bringing to the table? And what I think the admissions office wants, and what the best applicants are bringing to the table, are professors who are at the top of their fields, who have written letters of recommendation before to these law schools. They're probably known by the law schools. They have a strong record of recommending people who have gotten in and who have proceeded to do well at the law school. And what they're really looking for from these professors is basically something along the lines of, in my years of teaching, and hopefully there will be a lot of years, this student who I'm recommending is the best I've had, or is the best at something, or is one of the best. You need them to draw, not only sing your praises, but do so in a very specific way that communicates to the law school that you are one of the best people this professor has had, and then they can explain why. So, if the only thing that the professor knows about you is that you got an A in his class, well, so what? I mean, a lot of people get A's in his class. You'll need to do a lot of things beyond getting an A in the class, although I think that's a minimum. Beyond getting an A in the class, really create some kind of academic, intellectual distinction or mark that will provide the fodder for a good letter of recommendation. So what I think that this probably lends itself toward is a couple things. I think, first of all, if you can take multiple courses with with these professors who you want to cultivate, I think that would be better, and particularly if through these different courses that you take with them, they get to see different sides of your personality and your capabilities and skills. I think taking seminars is a very good idea, because on a week-to-week basis, they'll see how that you've done the reading, how you engage and interact with your classmates, how persuasive you are in arguing and sort of doing the coursework. Paper writing classes are obviously an opportunity really to distinguish yourself and show your abilities in that respect, and also to take on creative, interesting projects. If you can do some kind of independent study with these professors, I think that's a very good idea. One of the professors who I ultimately asked for a letter of recommendation, one of the ways I had gotten to know him was that I took a summer seminar course with him. It was a small seminar about constitutional law. So that was obviously pertinent. And I wrote a paper at the end of that class on sort of originalism and Brown versus Board of Education, which my professor thought was a very creative, interesting paper. And in fact, I remember I learned later that he talked about it when he taught the course again. The paper made a mark on him. And then I also worked with him to turn that paper into something published. So I ended up getting it published in a law review, which obviously was sort of a useful thing. And in fact, now that I think about it, once I had that law review article published, I then took that law review and also turned it into a newspaper op-ed for a local African American newspaper, and then that op-ed that I did, I was then able to sort of use that to engage and get to know a professor who taught history, but with a focus on African American history and African American issues, and he was an older African American man himself, and so he and I got to know each other. He was sort of intrigued by my conservative political views, and then he ended up being another reference, and which obviously sort of added a unique, interesting dimension to my background. Now, so these are all ideas on how you can get to know these professors. I think obviously being a research assistant for these professors is a very good idea, another way to get to know them. And I think this research assistant point actually lends itself to another thing that I strongly encourage, that in addition to doing well in these courses and sort of showing your academic rigor, I definitely recommend that you get really well acquainted with these professors' academic and professional work, the work that they're doing. You have to remember at the end of the day that, especially when you're at a top-tier undergraduate school, these professors aren't there because they're great teachers. I mean, they might be good teachers, but the reason that they got into top PhD programs and ultimately are on the path to getting tenure or are tenured is because they're at the top of their field in terms of the research that they're doing and their contributions they're making to their field. So if you can read their academic papers, if you can read their books, if you can follow their public speaking and their lectures, I mean, not only is that going to help you to understand their perspective, understand where they're coming from, that's going to obviously help you do well in their course. But it's also just going to, you're going to have that's going to provide opportunities to get to know them and engage them. I mean, if you go to, I think if you read a paper that they wrote, or you hear a lecture that they did, and then you go to their office hours and you talk to them and say, look, I read this paper, I was really interested in that point, I had some questions about that other thing, maybe I disagree with some element of your thesis, and this is why, and then that can just open up a lot of different avenues. So I would definitely recommend that. So this is obviously something that you can do for different professors, and ideally, obviously, these professors are going to be people who, now that you've gone through these earlier modules and you have some sense of what your hook will be, where you're going to try to distinguish yourself as the best applicant, hopefully these professors will be researchers or scholars, or at least teaching courses on areas that are generally pertinent to to this broader theme of your application. So that's another thing to think about. And so that professor who I wrote that paper on about the Brown versus Board, what I did to really continue to engage him throughout my time in college was that I not only took additional courses with him, but I also approached him about doing an independent study. And what that independent study led to was that I did a separate paper looking at the ethics surrounding drug manufacturing or intellectual property and how it relates to drug manufacturing and so forth. And then the other thing I did too is whenever he would give lectures, I remember, in fact, he had gone on leave for 1 year and he gave a lecture at Brown. And I attended the lecture, and then there were a lot of people who attended the lecture. But what I did was, afterwards I sent him an email and I told him, that was I took notes during the lecture. There were some things that were provocative about what he said, and I wrote him a note and I, just gave him some feedback. And I sent him the note and I didn't really think a lot of it. But then I remember, when I was approaching him for a letter of recommendation later, that was the thing he remembered, and he brought it up. So small gestures like that really go a long way. Now, here's what I recommend in terms of, okay, so at least 2 of these letters of recommendation have to be from your undergraduate professors. Now, the question is, so what do you do about additional letters of recommendation? Now, as we talked about in the previous module, hopefully for at least one of the schools that you're applying to, you will have done something to establish some sort of a special connection with that school. And my strong hope for you will be that for at least one school, one of your letters of recommendation will be from someone, from that experience who can make a specific pitch for that particular school. So ideally that will be a professor of that law school who will say, look, obviously I'm on the faculty here. I would love if you can admit this applicant because I've already worked with him. I've seen the great work he can do. We've begun to collaborate on some projects. If he goes here, we'll continue that. That obviously is going to make an impact. Okay, but the question is, so, what about for the schools who you don't have that kind of a thing for? And here's what I would say. Okay, if you have 2 professors who are both going to say, just write glowing letters about you, say that you're going to, you're one of the best students they've had, or you distinguish yourself in some way, what I would say is that, the other 2 letters that you send in, I think that you have to think about, are they adding something new? Are they telling the admissions office something new that isn't readily apparent from these other 2 letters of recommendation? And that's just going to depend on a lot of different factors, on the kinds of different things you've done, how long you've been out of law school, out of college before you are applying. But I think the test case here has to be that, are these letters going to be at least as good as these other 2? Because you don't want the way a former admissions dean at Yale put it, you don't want the meh factor to kick in. You don't want 2 really glowing letters and then the third one comes and it's sort of a not really noteworthy letter, and then it just it isn't adding value. But, I mean, obviously, if these different letters of recommendation can add a new dimension or add new value, then I think you certainly want to take the opportunity. So, like a very obvious example of when you would want this third letter of recommendation would be like if you've done if you have a graduate degree or you're doing some kind of grad school before applying to law school. I mean, obviously, I think you want one of your professors from graduate school to be writing this letter of recommendation. Um, I think another thing might be, let's say you're a double major in two seemingly disparate things. So maybe you're like uh, a physics major and also a sociology major. Like that's your double major. Um, I think obviously, and then maybe, within the sociology, maybe you took one course that was more focused on foreign or international policy and another that was focused on domestic urban policy, and you know and maybe one was like a seminar, primarily seminar courses or a series of seminars that you took with one professor, whereas another where you wrote some really creative paper. Yeah, that calls for three different papers, one who can talk about your physics capabilities, and then two others who show different sides of your academic nature. Um, I think another that you might want to think about is if you have some kind of notable work experience or sort of a not strictly academic experience where it would be helpful for someone writing a letter to comment on your aspirations or goals outside of academia. One of the things I had done was when I was applying to law schools, I made it clear that I was interested in the law, yes, but I also noted that my longer-term aspiration was to really be a practitioner and a policy official advisor in the foreign policy world. And one of the people who I had worked with during my summers in college, who I became close to, was a former high-ranking Defense Department official, and he was also a lawyer by training, and he had practiced law for many years, and I had him write a letter of recommendation, talking about not only the work I had done helping him on his memoir, but I had him write on the letter I'm confident that Pratik will go on to be a notable advisor to the president on foreign policy, something like that. And so, something like that, obviously, it's one thing for some pointy-headed academic to say that, is another for someone to say it who's actually been at that level. So, think about people like that who you can talk to. Now, one of the realities is that, you may, I wish this weren't true, but it is, that even when you one of the things you'll find is that people who you might approach about writing a letter of recommendation, you might have a really solid relationship with them. You might think they're going to just really pour their hearts out and make the effort to write a good letter of recommendation. But the reality is that people just have different attitudes or different mentalities or different levels of engagement on how much they care about writing a good letter of recommendation, being diligent about deadlines, just putting in the effort generally, or even just frankly in their raw capacity or capability even to write a good letter of recommendation. And so, as much as you do the work here, the reality is that to some degree this isn't under your control entirely. And so I'm going to offer you two concrete pieces of advice on how you can, to put it maybe in investing terms, like diversify, manage your risk a little bit, and so forth. And I'm going to offer two suggestions here. Okay. In fact, I'm going to offer three suggestions, actually. So one is that you want to always be on the lookout for different opportunities. Maybe there are fellowships, maybe there are awards that you want to apply to, maybe there are jobs, like anything that requires a letter of recommendation before you apply to law school. Um, or in fact even concurrently with law school, and use these as like trial runs to try to line up letters of recommendation. Um, so, for example, like there are certain fellowships that you apply for, like your sophomore year in college. These are really great opportunities to go ask for a letter of recommendation, because you'll start that process of engaging them. You'll get a sense of how they react, how willing they are, what they do with the letter. Um, and then if the thing goes well, then obviously it's going to be you're going to be in a good shape to go back to them later and just like update the letter and approach them again. Um, or you might find that they, when it came time to asking for a letter of recommendation, they just weren't really responsive, and then that maybe that's not the professor that you want to really invest in. I think another idea here is to, on a related note, is to apply for fellowships and so forth, uh, where you need more than 4 letters of recommendation. So the classic thing to do here would be to apply for a Rhodes Scholarship, where you need 8 letters of recommendation. Um, and this is going to do a number of things. One, I mean, you're going to have to line up 8 letters of recommendation, and you have a good reason to be doing so. I mean, not only because the Rhodes is important, but also like it's going to, even if you don't ultimately win it, it's going to communicate and signal to these professors that you're applying that, look, you're a serious guy. You're applying for a Rhodes Scholarship, a really prestigious thing, or whatever you're applying for. I mean, it's just going to show that you're someone who's putting themselves out there. You're competitive. You're serious, and and one of the things you'll find, especially when you're asking for 8 letters of recommendation or some substantial amount, is you'll be surprised, but some of these people will show you the letters that they wrote. I mean, I'm forgetting now exactly, but I applied for a Rhodes, and of the 8 letters that I ultimately got, I want to say like 5 of them or something actually showed me the letters that they sent. Even though obviously I had waived my right to see them, they just did it. And the other thing that will happen too is that some of these people will actually ask you to do a first draft of the letter. Now I'm going to come to this is related to my second and third pieces of advice. I strongly encourage you to learn a great deal generally about best practices when it comes to writing letters of recommendation. And I think that there are 2 reasons for that. Okay, one is in the scenario where you might actually have to write your own letter of recommendation, and this is just such a gift, such an opportunity that you're getting, because you're now in control of your own fate here. But even if you don't get that opportunity, what I strongly recommend doing is that you want to make life as easy as possible for your references, and you also want to sort of steer them and guide them as much as you possibly can to make sure that everything they're writing in their letter is congruent and with your application, and is really amplifying the messages or themes of what you want out of their letters. And the easiest way to do that is that when you approach them, don't just sort of say, oh, I need a letter of recommendation, can you write one? What you want to do is really like give them a really well organized, really detailed outline, a memo, or however you want to organize it, but that tells them exactly what you're applying for, exactly why you're going to them, not other people, and give them suggestions on what you want them to say, because you can't, even if you really know these people, even if you know they mean the best for you, you have to remember that at the end of the day, you're one of many people who they're going to be doing this for, and that they probably have done throughout their career. Um, so, what I did for each and every one of my letters of recommendation, I wrote a letter and a memo to them. I told them what I need the letter for, why I'm going to them, and what are the points that I want them to hit. So, for example, with that Defense Department official who I had worked for, this line that he put in the letter about my becoming an advisor to the president on foreign policy, like, he didn't come up with that. I mean, it was something that I made very clear in my request to him that he note. Obviously, it was up to him to do it, but he did do it. Um, uh, with the judge who I talked about earlier, I wrote in my note to him, I said, in addition to talking about the paper I wrote for you and my kind of mastery over the legal issues that we talked about, you might also mention my kind of record in high school tennis and how I got to know you there. And he ended up showing me his letter, and his letter sort of followed almost to a T the outline that I had given him. So I would definitely, definitely be really well organized. Um, and the final point I'll make here is that um, you you want to be as organized and take this on as early as you possibly can, because even if you write here that you tell them that you have a hard deadline or whatever, unfortunately there just is no guarantee that that they're going to get it done on time. So you want to leave yourself with room here. And then, once you go through this whole process and you have a sense of who's willing to write a letter, hopefully you'll have an idea of what they're writing for you, or maybe they'll show you the letter. At that point, use your judgment about, one, how many of these letters you actually want to send in to the law schools. Your best strategy might be to send only 2. Some people might want to send in 4. That's just going to depend and vary. And then you'll also need to make a judgment on, assuming that you're applying to more than one school, do you want to use the same letters, or maybe if you have more than 2, maybe you want to sort of send a different combination to each of the different schools. And that's going to depend on partly on what your strategy is for each of the different schools, but you also may just want to diversify your risk a little bit. So, like, for example, because I'd gone through the process of doing the roads, I had these 8 letters to play around with. And, like, one of the professors who I approached for a letter of recommendation, I had gotten to know her very well. She taught sort of the history of American foreign relations, which obviously was, like, right in line with what I was interested in. I had gotten to know her pretty well. I'd taken a bunch of courses with her. She had actually approached me, sort of offering to write a letter. But at the end of the day, she was one of the few people who didn't show me her letter of recommendation. So I used her letter for 1 or 2 of the schools that I applied to, but I didn't use it for all 4, just because there was an element of uncertainty here. So hopefully this gives you a number of action items on what to do. Start early, really cultivate these relationships, think about what they add and don't add, really get to know these professors and their academic work. Hopefully you'll have at least one letter that's tailored to the school that you've invested in, and then really be organized and really, like, understand in detail what it takes to write a good letter of recommendation, and then really prepare a good package, a good memo that you use to approach each of these professors or whoever is writing your references, so that you give them very clear guidance and they know exactly what you want them to write. Okay, talk to you soon.